after you've performed the required configuration of setting up and installing your apps, your service accounts, and your scam profiles for your M365 tenants in preparation for your tenant-to-tenant migration, you're now ready to go into Fly and start setting up your actual migration projects. To do that, we go to the home page and just click on Fly. The very first time you come into Fly, you're going to land on the Setup Assistant. This is here to show you that you've got your configuration complete, or if you hadn't, to remind you to go back up to AvePoint Online Services to finish those things off. But we can see here our app profiles are configured, our service accounts are configured, and our scam profiles are configured, and the next step is to go and start working on our migration projects. To do that, I'll scroll down and click on Close, and you can see we're back here on our dashboard. Since we haven't done any migrations yet, nothing here to see. On the left-hand side, you've got your navigation from your projects through your download center for any reporting that you're generating and downloading, and then we have settings. We're actually going to start over here because creating migration projects takes you through a wizard, and the wizard will ask you for some of these things. First, we have our tags, which are exactly as you think they would be. You can assign tags to your migration projects, and this will help with sorting and filtering views later on. This video, though, we're going to focus on migration policies. The migration policy is actually the last step in the wizard when you're creating a project, but it's one of those critically important considerations. Think of it as all of the extra settings that are going to go into your migration outside of source, destination, and tags. So if I click on Migration Policies, we can see here that we can do different policies for the various Microsoft 365 objects. How about we do Microsoft Teams? Please note, the options that will be presented to you within each policy are going to be at least a little different, like for instance between SharePoint and OneDrive, but they also may be very different, like for instance between Exchange and Teams. Different considerations. So if I know I'm going to do a Teams to Teams migration, I want to get out ahead of these different settings. So to create this, up at the top, I click Create Migration Policy. Now please note, once we're in the migration policy, there will be a point where it will ask us about mappings, like for instance, user mapping from source to destination. I can do that ahead of time, so I have that available as a drop-down once I get in here, or you can build it when you're in here. So we click Create Migration Policy. First, give it a name. Now, as I name this, please keep in mind that you can create as many of these migration policies as necessary because not every team-to-team migration is going to be the same. They're not all going to require exactly the same choices. So if you do build multiples of these, it's probably a good idea to come up with some type of naming convention. For our purposes here, I'm going to keep it very simple. And we add a description. And then down at the bottom, we click Next. On step 2, filter and conflict resolution. So right up at the top, we get our first series of choices. What do you want to migrate and what do you not want to migrate? You can see that these are mostly just simple checkboxes. Do you want to migrate apps from source to destination? The various tabs up at the top. How about Planner? What about Membership? Now you can see membership is actually unchecked. If you already have an existing team in the destination, well, you already have the users that you require. But that's not, of course, always the case. So I could say, yes, I do want to bring the membership over. Conversations, tags, recordings. Recordings are fairly large files, especially for long meetings. So that's why this is unchecked, not making the assumption that you want to bring over those historical meetings. If you do, you just add the check. Down below that, how do we want to handle channel conversations? Recreate them, essentially put them in line in the chat, and you can cut it off at a certain date if you would like to, and archive messages to an HTML file in the channels file folder. You can see both of those are active as a default, so you'll get your messages in line in the chat, and you'll get them as a historical archive. If you prefer one or the other, simply clear whichever one it is that you don't need. Down below that, how do we want to handle the SharePoint site that supports the team? All data or only the default documents library? Simple choice. And then what do we want to do about the group mailbox? Now the mailbox is unchecked as a default. The logic there is you may or may not want to actually migrate that mailbox, so we don't make an assumption. If you want it, again, you simply check it off. Keeping in mind, of course, that the mailboxes can potentially be very large, and this could potentially impact the overall time that your migration job takes to run. But so does checking anything or unchecking something. Scrolling down at the bottom, we have our conflict resolution. For the SharePoint team site, the default you can see is merge. You can also skip. So if you do have a destination environment and you are merging into that, so a team from a source into an existing team in the destination, we're going to try to merge all content from the source into the destination. You can see including the sites, lists, and libraries. If you don't want that, if you want to migrate over some other aspects of the team, but not the actual content, then you could tell it to skip. Below that, SharePoint team site files. So this is for the containers, and this is going to be for the individual files. Here you have skip, overwrite, overwrite by last modified time, which means if there is a conflict, whichever individual file has been updated most recently, that's the one that wins. That's the one that you keep. And then finally, mailbox items. If you are doing the mailbox, then how do you want to handle your mailbox items from source to destination? If everything's the way that I like, I'm going to click Next. Now we get to additional options and mappings. So right up at the top, replace email addresses of senders and recipients based on user mappings. If you select that, you can scroll down and you can see here is where I can input the user mappings. Now I mentioned earlier that you could do that ahead of time out here so that you would have it staged in the dropdown. If you have not, you can click this plus sign here. But what is a user mapping? A user mapping is essentially done by domain name or by individual user or group. The logic here for domain is if you have in your source environment one domain name and in your destination tenant a different domain name, you would like to map from one to the next. To do it by user, this is primarily going to be if a group or a username has changed. If I have Ron D in the source, but Ronald.Delaney in the destination, I would like to make sure that those are mapped to each other. So if you require that, you would set either or both of those up, and back out here, that would essentially clear this warning message. Replace meeting links with the destination information. That could also be useful. And it tells us user mapping again must be configured. The next two sections are all about how to handle your sensitivity labels. Keep existing labels, do not copy labels to the destination, apply the same labels, which means that those labels must exist in the destination, and then configure custom labels, which must exist in both to try to align those. Now that's for files and emails. What about labels on Teams? Similar options. Scrolling down, we had the user mappings, which we talked about a second ago, and now below that, automatic mapping when user and groups are not configured in the user mappings. How do I actually map them to each other? Principal name prefix, display name, and then if there's an email prefix, and you can rearrange these if you needed to. So essentially, going back to the example I mentioned a moment ago, if I have Ron D in the source and Ron D in the destination, that's fine. It'll figure it out and align those based on this information. If I don't have Ron D in the destination, because I'm changing it from Ron D in the source to Ronald.Delaney in the destination, that is absolutely where you would want to go in and put that in the user mapping. Because here, it will not be able to align those. Lastly, on this step, we have custom features down here at the bottom. We're going to cover the custom feature of the policy in a later video. So for now, we'll just click Next. The last step, notifications. One of the great things about Fly is that you can send notifications in a couple of different ways based on how your project is running. Send project level notifications, send individual mapping level notifications. The project level notifications, you can determine how many times a day you want that to go. Below that, when to send the first notification, and who to send the notification to via email address. Underneath that, you can pick an email template, and the email templates can be modified under email settings over here on the left. So basically what you're looking at here is like a roll-up for all mappings within an individual project. And by mappings here, let's be clear, we're not talking about the same exact thing we talked about on the previous screen, not user mappings. This is a Teams migration policy, and you'll see in the later video when we do our projects, the mapping is the individual workspace in the source to the individual workspace in the destination. So if I had 10 source teams mapped to 10 destination teams, I could get a once-a-day roll-up of how all of those migrations went. This could be especially useful if you're doing incremental migrations over time. If I want, though, I can also have it send me individual mapping level notifications. So within my example I gave a moment ago, every day on a schedule for the next 2 weeks, you're running incremental migrations of those 10 source teams into 10 destination teams. You can get notifications on the individual mappings rather than the entire thing, essentially 10 notifications rather than 1. This is especially useful if any of your mappings are having trouble while the rest of them are fine. Send it to me for failed mappings only. 9 out of 10 of them work perfectly. 1 of them runs into an issue. You would only get the notification just for the one that had the issue, allowing to focus your troubleshooting. You can also say for all mappings. This will of course generate many more notifications, but if you want to ensure that everything is fine, then you would select that second option. Now, who does it go to? The person running the migration, who has come in here and created and saved that project. You can of course do additional recipients. Perhaps you are overseeing a team and you have team members setting those up, but you want to receive the notifications as well. Great, drop your additional recipient's email address in there. And of course the email template, as I mentioned earlier, that can be configured if need be over here under email settings. Now in our case, we will not be able to save this if we tell it that we do want to send the email notifications because I have not picked an email template. So I click my plus sign here to create the email template. First thing is to give it a name. And for type, you can see we have the 2 different types. Below that, you can set up a specific logo if you'd like to use your company logo instead of the default one that we have available. And how would you like that to look? For successful, if you told it you want to report on everything, and for failed. For our purposes here, I'm fine with the default messaging, and I'm just going to click on Save. So now that we have that in place, we are ready to save our Teams migration policy. So once again, name and type, what you want to actually migrate and what you don't, plus what to do if there's a conflict. Keeping in mind, of course, conflict cannot occur if the destination is empty. If you're migrating a team without targeting a destination team, an existing team in the destination, there was no possibility for a conflict. It'll create new. Additional options and mappings like choices around mapping individual users. And then finally, some very powerful notification options. If this all looks good, we click Save. And now we can see we have our Teams migration policy ready to be used when I do Teams migration projects. If I'm going to do Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Groups, same steps. Go to Exchange Online, create migration policy, walk through the wizard, keeping in mind, as we said at the beginning in this video, you will get very different options because these are different types of objects with different choices to make. Thanks for watching this short video on how to create a migration policy in preparation for setting up migration projects in AvePoint Fly.